Welcome back, everyone. This is Dave from Corman Productions, here to do a rewatch video of Quantum Leap, Season 1, Episode 1, Genesis. Quantum Leap was the series back in the day that ran from 1989 to 1993, starring Scott Bakula as a time-traveling scientist leaping from life to life, putting right what once went wrong, hoping that the next leap will be the leap home. And the hologram that only he can see, played by Dean Stockwell, Al Calavici. The series was created by Donald Belzerio, and was a pretty popular series back in the day, and has enduring popularity even to this day. If you look for content on this series, however, such as YouTube videos or podcasts, you won't find many, which I guess shouldn't be too surprising for a 30-year-old series. So I figured I'd create some, just for ha-has. I don't know how many of these rewatch videos I'm going to do. A lot of that depends on the audience I have for it. When originally aired, the first episode was actually more like a 2-hour film. In subsequent broadcasts, it was broken down into 2 parts. The version that I was recently looking at was the original hour-and-a-half long episode. But since this is partly a commentary video, as well as a recap, I am likely going to break this down into multiple parts, because this video will get way too long if I don't. Before going any further, I will let you know that this is not a spoiler-free video, so if you have not yet watched the episode, though it's 31 years old, so I'm not sure why you're here if you didn't watch it. And yeah, but this is not a spoiler-free video, so I would recommend watching that episode before watching this one. And if you like this video and my content in general, hit this video up with a like, a comment, a share, and please subscribe to my channel. We start off in the far-flung future of 1999. Okay, so I guess I'm getting right into the commentary right now, right off the bat. In 1999 probably sounded sufficiently futuristic. The creators had no idea that the show would have enduring popularity and be watched even to this day. But there's actually a more practical reason why it was only set 10 years in the future. The conceit of the series and Dr. Beckett's time-traveling theory was that you could only leap within your own lifetime. This is how Donald Belzerio sold the series, as a way to save money so that they could use existing sets and existing costuming to keep the money from producing the series down. My mom, who was a fan of the series back in the day, hated this conceit. She thought it limited the interesting stories that could be told if you could go anywhere in time. There are some who question why Sam Beckett only leaped around in America. Well, first of all, this actually isn't true, because there were a few times where Dr. Beckett leaped out of the country, such as the Vietnam episode that started Season 4. But I would assume that whoever's leaping him around in time would want Sam Beckett to actually be useful in order to right the right that once went wrong. I said that in reverse. If he leaps into a part of the country or the world where he doesn't speak the language, doesn't know the customs, his value in that situation would be extremely limited. Plus, the show eventually would go on to suggest that there were other leapers other than Sam Beckett. So presumably, there would be people who would actually be more useful leaping around outside the country. Anyway, because of the in-your-own lifetime conceit, Donald Belzerio could not set the series too far into the future. If you, for instance, set it in 2040, Sam would basically be leaping around in time, always in the future, and every week you would have to conceptualize what that future looked like. Plus, I'm sure there were stories that he wanted to tell about Vietnam and so on and so forth that he wouldn't be able to tell if he had the series set in the future. So a date of 1999 was set for the series. So anyway, we open up in the far-flung future of 1999. We see a car speeding around down a long road in New Mexico. It turns out to be Al Calvici. He spots a woman who's having car trouble. A flat. Al, being the lecherous guy that he is, says he would love to help her out, but he's wearing a tux and he just doesn't have the time. But she could always come with him. He suggests that he's extremely friendly, and she says that is what she's afraid of. But she ends up getting in the car, and they speed along when they notice some lights. Al makes a lame excuse about what the lights are, which the woman does not buy. And then he uses his little digital control panel, the futuristic 1999 technology, to call in to the lab. Gushy, played by Dennis Wolfberg, who sadly passed away at the age of 48 a year after the series ended, answers the phone. And we see a room with him screaming, and there's a lot of steam and smoke and all that. And he's telling Al that Sam is leaping. And Al tells him, he can't leap, the project isn't ready yet. And Gushy responds, "Tell Sam that." And we see Sam Beckett waving his arms around, laughing. And we cut back to Al, who says he'll be right there. And he steps his foot on the pedal of the gas, and away the car zooms towards the project. And credits, which are totally different from what we see in the regular series. We're just flying through the clouds. Presumably this is Sam traveling through time. Eventually we find ourselves zooming in on the ground, and then right into a house. Dr. Sam Beckett wakens up. He doesn't remember anything. He says to himself that he did it, but then he doesn't remember what exactly it is that he did. And he soon finds himself awake next to a woman, a very pregnant woman. And he doesn't seem to know this woman. She calls him Tom because he's leaped into Tom Stratton, though of course he doesn't know this yet. He doesn't know anything. She tells him that she will put the coffee on. And Sam Beckett, for the first time, says his famous catchphrase, "Oh boy." Sam finds himself disoriented and about to take a shower, confused by everything, most likely because the technology isn't the futuristic technology of 1999. His wife, which I say in quotation marks, seems to think that Tom is just clowning around. Apparently the guy he leaped into was quite the prankster, and that is very convenient for Sam. He eventually looks at a mirror and sees a mirror image that is not his own. He starts to think of this as a dream until he sees that image and starts freaking out, causing his wife to come back in. Sam's acting all the world like a crazy person, asking who she sees in the mirror, and she sees Tom Stratton. Sam's wife is played by Jennifer Runyon. Her name is Peggy Stratton, by the way. I haven't made that clear yet. But for the longest time, I thought this role was played by Mariel Hemingway. But I was very wrong about that as I check Internet Movie Database. Jennifer Runyon was also very briefly in Ghostbusters, the original one. She has a very curious career because she actually took a 21-year break in between acting gigs from 1993 to 2015. Eventually, Tom Stratton's son comes into the room announcing that Captain Burdell is on the phone. And Sam is stunned that he has a son. Peg is growing increasingly concerned about Tom's behavior she tells her son to go tell Burdell that he will call him back. And then suddenly, Sam remembers the project phone number. He rushes out of the shower, hangs up on Captain Burdell, and tries to call the project, but gets a weird dial tone, because this is the past. September 13th, 1956 to be exact, and phone numbers did not have as many numbers as Sam is attempting to dial. The television is playing Howdy Doody, which is a show we also saw in Back to the Future. Sam, still confused, makes his way outside, still with shaving cream on, and wearing only a pair of boxers, which I'm sure his neighbors greatly appreciate. He spots a plane flying very nearby, over his head, doing aerial maneuvers. Sam, in his inner monologue, declares, "This isn't a dream. It's a nightmare. And if it's a nightmare, sooner or later, there's going to be a boogeyman." Yes, Sam, there actually is going to be a boogeyman. But we don't want to talk about that episode. We cut to Sam driving in a car with Captain Burdell. He's decided to play along with the dream, as we hear in a monologue. Not that he has much choice in the matter. He's recapping everything he understands up to this point, including that his best friend is simply called Bird Dog. Captain Burdell decides to act as lecherous as Al eventually does, or does throughout the series, and he pulls over when he spots a good-looking woman. I suppose that this series' treatment of women, or rather its portrayal, would be considered problematic during the current time. But this was a 1989 series, of course. And this show was as progressive as it came, tackling many social issues throughout its 5-year run. But this scene actually serves the function of giving Sam and us more information. Apparently Tom Stratton is a pilot, one of the very few who is brave enough to fly the X-2. This is a problem for Sam because he doesn't know how to fly a plane. Anyway, after hitting on this girl for a little while, they get back on the road, and Tom says nervously, or rather Sam as Tom asks, "So, we're one of the few people who are brave enough to fly the X-2, eh?" And Bird Dog simply replies, "Well, hey, you gotta impress the ladies to score." And Sam says, "What if I told you I couldn't fly?" And Burdell asks, "Are you sick?" And Sam says, "No, but when I woke up this morning, I couldn't remember how to fly." Burdell laughs, thinking that this is some kind of prank that Tom is trying to pull, and says, "Who are we going to try this on?" But Sam insists that it isn't a joke. Bird Dog is all like, "Well, damn, Tom, it sounds like you mean it." And Sam once again insists that he does. Bird Dog snorts and says, "Well, that's what makes you the best." That sincere look. Bird Dog eventually ends up suggesting that they pull this little prank on Weird Ernie. Bird Dog says that they will tell him that flying faster than Mach 2 is messing with their minds. And then we cut to Weird Ernie, played by legendary character actor Bruce McGill. You would know him if you see him. He's pretty much everywhere. And he has the distinct honor of starting the series and then appearing in the final episode as well. Weird Ernie asked a basic question: affecting your minds how? And as it turns out, Tom and Bird Dog have gotten the other pilots to be part of this scheme, as they recount memories of missing memories, like not being able to remember where they parked their car, which, honestly, I can never remember where I parked my car ever. I have to set off my car alarm to find my car. And I have never flown at speeds faster than Mach 2. Al Calvici is part of this scene, He's just kind of standing around. Sam Beckett does not recognize him. Eventually, Weird Ernie asks if they could do a study on the memory loss thing. Dr. Berger is played by W.K. Stratton, and he actually has 5 different appearances on this series. Acting-wise, he hasn't done anything since Jag back in 2003, though he does have a credit for Transformers the Game. Dr. Berger suggests that he should be able to come up with something, and Weird Ernie says good. And he says, "This is the most interesting development. Thank you, gentlemen." And all the pilots are smiling. Ernie goes on to say that the fire warning light that they've been getting at speeds of Mach 2 is a result of inadequate insulation, and they've corrected the problem. So, hopefully going forward, that will no longer be an issue. Sam finally seems to notice Al, who's wearing an outfit that is strangely conservative for his character. Eventually, he would go on to wear some extremely wacky outfits. Sam smiles at him, and Al looks at him without saying anything. There's some macho banter among the pilots, and eventually Al says to Sam, "Oh, I like that guy. He reminds me of me, back in the old days." And Sam simply gives him a nod, which is convenient because if he were to talk to him, people would start questioning why he was talking to thin air, which he would do quite a bit throughout the series. The meeting is dismissed. Everybody makes their way to their stations. Sam ends up standing next to Al, and we hear the hologram sound effect. Al asks him, "Isn't this a kick in the butt?" And Sam non-verbally acknowledges him before continuing to walk on, still not having a clue. We have a weird cut to Peggy, who's with her friends, asking about which stretch marks on which leg are less noticeable. And when they point to one leg, Peg says, "Oh, well, this is the leg that I'm using the cactus cream on." And then we cut back to a plane preparing to take off, the X-2. And then back and forth to the women, who notice the plane taking off because the house is shaking. Peggy says that she needs to stop drinking so much coffee. It's making her jumpy. We cut to Sam in the pilot's seat. He's not yet flying the airplane. He says in his inner monologue that given enough time, you can get used to anything, including a nightmare. After some banter between the pilots, Sam says to himself, "You know what? I'm actually beginning to enjoy this." But then his co-pilot turns over the reins to him, while he goes to answer Mother Nature. And Sam starts to look a little freaked. The airplane starts to take a little bit of a nosedive as we hear the Quantum Leap theme. When we come back from our commercial break, we're on the ground, and Weird Ernie is asking, "Hey, is there a problem up there?" And Sam, who seems to be having a panic attack and making no real effort to try to fly this plane, just starts screaming. Eventually, his co-pilot comes back and asks, "What's wrong?" And Sam simply says, "I can't fly." Eventually, Bird Dog gets control of the plane and makes a lame excuse to cover for Sam Beckett, or rather, Tom Stratton. Bird Dog tells Sam, "Save it for Weird Ernie, because I'm never going to fall for this." But Sam keeps insisting that he can't fly. Cut to Peggy, who's making coffee, and apparently has a way to listen in on the transmissions from the plane. Cut to Weird Al giving them permission to drop. And he pounds on his head, which is, I guess, is where his injury was from the war, and says out loud, "Good luck." While he and Weird Al, or rather Dr. Berger, look at the plane through binoculars. They eject one of the pilots from the airplane, which, okay, so I guess that plane that they're dropping now with the pilot in it is actually the X-2, not this bigger plane that they're flying. Sam spots Al in the back of the plane, who waves at him, and Sam waves back. And Sam asks, "Is everybody where they're supposed to be?" Bird Dog looks back and doesn't see Al, because only Sam can see Al, and says that everything looks fine to him. And then he counts down to letting the X-2 go from the plane. The pilot fires off his rockets. The goal is to hit Mach 3. Things seem to be going well. And then the pilot hits rocket number 3. When he gets to Mach 2.8, he hears a sound that sounds like a coffee brewing. And then the fire warning light comes on. The fire light comes on, and the pilot turns the engines off, the rockets. The plane seems to be going down back to Mach 2 with no issues, so he thinks it might be a false alarm. The fire light goes off, so he's going to fly back to get a visual inspection. But he makes the mistake of trying to turn the plane when he's at Mach 2, and he spins out of control. And the plane blows up. We cut to Peggy hearing the sound and running out to check what's going on. She looks pretty freaked. Her friends soon join her, and eventually they spot some black smoke. That can't possibly be a good sign. But the pilot safely ejected before the explosion. We cut to the bar where the pilots are hanging out with their wives. Eventually, Bird Dog decides to pounce on a woman that he's noticed, cutting in on a guy that's already dancing with her. Peg holds Tom's hand, and Sam says in his inner monologue, "As nightmares go, this one is taking a decidedly pleasant turn." Even at 6 months, he found Peg stunningly beautiful, although I doubted she would believe it. It could be that pregnant woman holds some kind of strange attraction for me, but I think it's Peg. But whatever it is, the chemistry is definitely working. And I'll just have to keep reminding myself that I'm not really her husband. Sam, out loud, after staring at her for a long time, asks if Peggy would like to dance. Peggy seems surprised by this. She sounds a little skeptical, given that she is 6 months pregnant, but Sam simply says that he can reach around her stomach, and together they find themselves on the dance floor. Eventually, we notice Al in this bar, walking around in a tux. Peggy asks him, "Well, I want to know who you've been dancing with, mister." Sam, with a laugh, asks, "What?" And Peggy says, "Tom, you may be one of the best pilots ever, but you were born with 2 left feet. Until tonight." And Sam says, "Maybe I just needed a well-rounded partner." And they both laugh. "See, Sam, you already got the dad jokes down." Sam eventually notices Al. Al waves to him, and then Peg asks, "Who do you see standing over there?" She doesn't see Al, but she sees Doug, and she says as much. And Sam says, No, the guy in the tux." And Peggy's like, "A tux? In here?" Apparently this is not a world-class joint where you would wear a tux. Sam keeps going, and Peggy's eventually like, "Tom, everything is so nice, please don't spoil it." Sam says, "Either someone blocked the view of the guy in the tux, or the boogeyman has arrived. Whichever it was, I was going to find out." And Sam breaks away from his wife. He sits Peg down back in the booth. And Sam says that she's 6 months pregnant. You dance one and then you sit one out. Doctor's orders. Which is funny because he actually is a doctor, though he doesn't know that yet. Sam eventually talks her into it. Says he doesn't want her to overdo it. And he's going to go feed the jukebox as an excuse to go see Al. Al starts talking about how awesome everything is, while Sam just looks at him. Al goes on, and eventually Sam asks Al, "Am I dead?" Al is confused by the question, so Sam repeats it. Sam says it would explain a lot. He could be in a reverse reincarnation. I have never heard of that concept before. Al laughs and says, "That's a good one, Sam." And Sam is surprised that Al knows his name. And he asks, "Why do you know my name when nobody else does?" Al asks him, "Are you serious?" And Sam responds, "Dead serious. Get it? Do you get it?" That was a good one. I don't think Sam was joking, though. That would have been a good joke, though, if he thinks he's dead and then he says, "Dead serious." Anyway, moving on. Actually, Sam does get the joke, because a second later, Sam says, "No pun intended." It finally dawns on Al that Sam really doesn't recognize him, which Sam confirms. Nor does Sam remember the experiment. Al asks him, "What do you remember?" And other than the fact that he remembers his name and the project phone number, he remembers nothing. But if he's part of an experiment, that means he's not having a psychotic break. Try convincing Peggy of that, who is looking on concerned at the fact that Sam is talking to himself. Or rather, her husband is talking to himself. Al is getting increasingly despondent as he says, that putz Ziggy was right. And Sam says, "Wait, Ziggy, I remember Ziggy. He's a little guy with bad breath." No, that's actually Gushy. Bird Dog finally calls him on talking to himself and says that nobody is going to fall for that gag. Sam laughs and then notices that Al is gone. Sam exits the bar and finds Al talking to himself, muttering from a distance, and he exits through an invisible door. We hear the sound effect, but we don't see the door effect that we do in most of the rest of the series. And I have a question about this. Why does Al need to go anywhere? He doesn't for the rest of the series. He just opens the door and exits. There are plenty of things that change from the pilot to the regular series, and there were quite a few effects that are not yet present here. In fact, for instance, we never saw the leaping effect. And when we do see Sam leap, it's nothing like we generally see throughout the series. Shocked at seeing Al disappear into nothingness, Sam turns his attention to the sky and says, "Please, God, I would like to wake up now." We cut to Sam and Peggy driving home. And Sam says, while driving home in the dark, I never knew how hard it would be to drive in the road without striping." Peggy doesn't know what he's talking about because this is a very futuristic idea. And Sam says, "Well, if they painted the little stripes on the road, it'd be easier to follow the road." And Peggy says, "Oh, that's a good idea." And Sam nervously says, "Well, I got a few." And then they both laugh. After a beat, Peggy cuddles up to Sam and says, "Tonight was fun." And Sam says, "Good. But it was a little scary." And then Sam asks, "Why scary?" And Peggy responds, "Maybe because you wanted to dance." Peggy keeps going and basically describes a complete personality change, which, is basically what happened here. And then she points out that he was talking to himself at the jukebox. He manages to sidestep the question when he sees a series of road signs leading to a commercial. I guess that's how they used to do it. Eventually, Sam mentions that he had an electric razor, which Peggy knows not to be true of Tom. And she turns off the music and asks, "Tom, what's going on?" And he once again tries to explain that his name isn't Tom, which Peggy gets irritated with him because he said that this morning. And he says that his name is Sam. He doesn't know his last name, so don't bother asking. He looks in the mirror and sees Tom Stratton, but it's not him. He can't fly. When I woke up this morning, I didn't know you or Mikey. or anyone else at the base. I know it sounds like I belong in the loony bin, but it's the truth. The reason I sound different is because I am different. Peggy starts to get really upset, and Sam tries to comfort her. And eventually, Sam just tells her that she was right. It was just a prank. And Peggy is relieved, because she thought for a moment that perhaps he had a brain tumor. I'd be thinking serious mental illness, but this is the 1950s, so maybe that wasn't such a consideration back then. We eventually cut to Peggy and Sam sleeping. And eventually, we see the clock speed up. And Sam finds himself, or rather we find ourselves, traveling backwards from the house, back into the clouds. But then, right back into Peggy and Tom Stratton's house. Sam awakens. We have absolutely no clue what just happened. Not at this stage of the game, anyway. Long viewers of the series can get a general idea of what's going on. While Peggy sleeps, he eventually remembers some details about his life. The fact that he lived on a farm in Indiana. He eventually remembers that his dad died in 1974. And it occurs to him that being in 1956, his dad is still alive. He tries to get an operator to maybe get the number for his father. But he can't, because he doesn't remember his name. He can't remember the name nor the phone number. And he's getting frustrated and emotional. He eventually hangs up. And his son watches on. His son asks him, "What's wrong?" Sam claims to be just experiencing a cold. And his son asks him, "Do you want to skip this fishing trip?" And Sam asks, "What?" His son tells him that it's Saturday, and that he told him that they would go fishing on Saturday, but if he doesn't feel good, they can skip it. And Sam thinks about it and laughs and says, "What are you talking about? Nothing cures a cold like a good fishing trip." And we cut to Sam fishing with his son in a rather idyllic looking spot. But Sam fishes about as well as I do and manages to catch a tree. And he tells his son, "You don't want to do that, but I'll show you how it's done when I bring it back." Which Sam struggles to do. I used to go fishing with a former friend of mine, and I did about as well as Sam does here. All I ever managed to catch was trees, or tangle my lure, or so on and so forth. I was a terrible fisherman. Sam tries to tell his son that even the best fly fisherman gets his lure tangled, and the pros can bring it back without snap. And then his son tells him, "Can I try now, Daddy?" And he does so perfectly. Sam tells the kid to stay where he is, and that he is going to fish further up the stream. He says, "Roger that," and before Sam departs, his son tells him he knows that Sam is just trying to make him look good. "Yeah, that's it. Sure." Eventually, Al startles him by asking a question about the lure. Al is dressed in pajamas. Very professional, Al. Sam tries to put his hand through Al, hoping to feel something solid, no doubt. But he goes straight through, because Al is not there. Al is a hologram. And when Sam reacts startled, Al says, "Please don't yell. I got a hangover. Hurts my head. Yada, yada, yada." Al says that he should have stayed in bed with Tina. Tina will be brought up throughout the series as Sam's girlfriend. And as it turns out, the girl that we saw at the beginning of the episode that Al was hitting on is credited as Tina. So is that the same person that we see throughout or hear about throughout the series and eventually see? Because that's not something I ever picked up on. I didn't realize that that was the same Tina. Eventually, when we do see her again, she's played by a completely different actress. And Al eventually asks him, So you still don't remember me. And Sam confirms this. And Al says that's very sad. And eventually says that his name is Albert. Albert, what? I can't tell you because it's restricted information. Most of what you're going to want to know is restricted. So it would be easier for us if you don't ask a whole lot of questions. And Sam asks, what are you? And Al responds, that's a question, Sam. And Al says, I'm a man, like you. And Sam responds to this by once again putting his hand through Al. And he says with a laugh, not like me. And Al responds, oh no, this isn't me. This is a neurological hologram. It's an image that only you can see and hear. Well, wait a second, Al. I thought that this was restricted information. But Sam starts to remember something. It's a hologram tuned in through his neurons and, whatever. Neurons and mesons and, like I said, whatever. And Sam seems surprised that he knows that information. Al, exasperated, pulls out the hand link, which is completely clear and completely different from what we see in the rest of the series. Actually, the hand link ends up changing throughout the series to eventually its more colorful form as we eventually envision it when we think of the series. Anyway, Al says that Ziggy has come up with some scenarios, and Sam is like, once again, Ziggy, the guy with the bad breath. No, Al says, that's Gushy, who programmed Ziggy, which is inaccurate, and I think that's actually a lie on Al's part. Sam goes on to say that none of this existed in 1956, and Al says, only in theory, and Sam replies, but this is 1956, and Al says, for you, for me, not so much. You know, for a guy who said that most of the information Sam would want to know is restricted, he seems to be giving up quite a bit of information. But Sam asks him, what's his last name? And Al can't tell him. If Sam can't remember, Al can't tell him. And Sam replies, it's important. And Al's like, but it's also on Ziggy's no-no list. And Sam says, why? And Al responds, I can't tell you that. Well, what the hell can you tell me? Al says to him. Al can only tell him what he already knows. Well, that seems vaguely useless, but okay. And Al tells him that he was part of a time travel experiment that went a little caca. And Sam skeptically repeats what Al just said. A little caca? How a little caca? And then Al says, well, you're here, so that's a biggie. It's Nobel Prize time. You should be proud of that. And, Sam says, and Al says that they're experiencing technical difficulties getting him back. Sam replies to this by saying, well, that's great. I wake up in 1956 with a Swiss cheese memory, and you're having technical difficulties. And Sam asks him, whose brainchild is this? Yours? And then Al simply says, no. Al says he has to consult with Ziggy over the various scenarios for why he did not leap back when they tried to retrieve him. And Sam seems surprised that they tried to get him back. And Al says, of course we tried, but you wouldn't leap. And Sam very sarcastically is like, oh, so now it's my fault. And Al says, possibly. Did you tell anybody that you were not Tom Stratton? And Sam gets sheepish and reveals that he did, maybe, in fact, do that. And Al says that retrieving him is dependent on everybody believing that he is Tom Stratton. And Sam replies, they didn't believe me. How could they? Hell, I don't even believe me. And Al says, well, that's to be expected. To us, Tom looks like you. And Sam responds, he's with you? And Al says, of course. How do you think we located you? When you came in, he went out. If it's any consolation, his memory is full of holes too. Everybody believes that you have to be Tom Stratton, or are Tom Stratton, if we are going to be able to retrieve you on Tuesday. And Sam says, Tuesday, huh? Well, that's going to be a little late because I'm scheduled to fly the X2 on Monday. And Al responds to this by asking, did you ever think of taking flying lessons? And this seems like a good place to stop for this video. If you like this video and want to support the channel, please like, share, and comment on this video, as well as subscribing to my channel. Mostly so you can be notified when part 2 is uploaded. Anyway, that's end of part 1.